All right, welcome back to another episode of the Primal Shift podcast. In today's episode, we're going to talk about something potentially controversial depending on if you're in the low-carb or high-carb camp. I'm going to tell you why after 3 years of doing keto, I introduced more carbs into my diet again. So several years ago, I transitioned from a paleo to a ketogenic diet because I thought all carbs were evil. And so I cut everything out and maintained a fairly strict ketogenic diet for about 3 years. And by fairly strict, I mean I ate somewhere between 0 to 15 grams of carbs per day while working out, doing CrossFit, and doing all the things that I do on a daily basis. But then I changed course a little bit. And in this episode specifically, I'm gonna tell you a couple of things. Obviously, I'll tell you why I started eating more carbs again, but I'll also share a little bit of insight around the decision-making process so you can maybe take some of that information and fine-tune your own lifestyle, regardless if you're on the low-carb or on the high-carb camp. I think that there is room for both really, and there is no right or wrong. It really depends on you, your circumstances, and what might be the best diet or the best macronutrient composition for optimal performance and optimal health. So I'll talk about what is the default state of humans. So what are humans doing metabolically when they are born, when they are babies? I'm going to talk about the pros and cons of a low-carb ketogenic diet. I'll talk about what triggered me to include more carbs in my diet. Obviously, that's the core of the episode here. And I'll tell you why I think that keto is a great tool, but not necessarily a lifestyle requirement for everyone. I'm going to share with you how my performance and my biomarkers have changed. So anything from a lipid panel to my body fat between doing keto and introducing more carbs. I think that should be fairly interesting because there are a couple of things that are, I think, to be expected or that I expected, but others that I certainly did not. I'm going to talk about some of the common pitfalls when consuming carbohydrates that I've come across, and I'll share with you tips on how you can leverage low-carb eating, improve your health and well-being, and last but not least, some of the mistakes to avoid on a low-carb diet. So it's a fairly packed episode. I'm going to try to keep it as concise as possible, but it might be worthwhile to grab a pen and paper or hit the rewind button and listen to certain things again. But let's start with what is the default metabolic state. So when humans are born, they are usually in breastfed babies at least that is, they're usually in a light state of ketosis. Even though, and that is surprising, they are certainly not on a ketogenic diet, because whenever I've heard some nutritionists say, well, but babies are not in keto, they're not on a keto diet because breast milk obviously contains sugar in the form of lactose, for example. And in fact, breast milk consists of 40% of carbohydrates. So that's certainly not a ketogenic food by definition. But despite that, breastfed babies are usually in a mild state of ketosis. So they burn fat for energy, but they evidently also use the sugar, the carbohydrates in breast milk. So they are effectively dual fueling. And that is an interesting concept because on the one hand, carbohydrates are not essential. We don't need to consume carbohydrates because the body can make glucose from non-carbohydrate sources in a process called gluconeogenesis. I talked about that in the nutrition episode. But still, nature decided that carbs for newborns are evidently beneficial because otherwise human breast milk would not contain sugar, right? So, and I think the reason for that is because the energy demands of the growing infant are so big that the baby simply burns through all of that energy, especially through the sugar, so quickly that it then taps into fat as a source of energy, hence the baby is in ketosis. So it's dual fueling, as I mentioned, and if you just think about it, the incredible energy demands of a newborn, especially the growing brain, at that stage, the brain consumes about 60% of the energy while being only 13% of the mass, of the body mass. That's incredible. So the brain sucks up a lot of energy, including ketones from fat, as well as glucose from the milk sugar, right? And that should give us, some sort of clue that maybe carbohydrates aren't necessarily evil. However, we should also take into consideration that as we grow older, our energy demands likely change depending on your lifestyle. Obviously, I am 41 now, I'm not growing anymore. So without physical activity involved, my energy demands are likely significantly lower in comparison, based on body size, than a newborn. And so there might be something to be said about, we might require less energy to sustain optimal health as we get older. So, but still, there are certainly pros and cons of following a ketogenic diet, which is the reason why I've done it for several years, and I've done fairly well on it, to be quite honest. And one of the major advantages, as far as I'm concerned, of a low carbohydrate or ketogenic diet is that it improves your metabolic flexibility, meaning that it teaches your body to efficiently switch back and forth between burning fat and burning carbs as a source of energy, depending on what's available. And that's not only academically important, it has practical implications, because whenever I don't consume food in between meals or overnight or when I'm traveling or whatever the case might be where I don't have access to food, my body can burn fat for energy and I don't feel like I'm falling apart. Most people who are very much glucose driven, whose metabolism is incapable of burning fat for energy, they usually fall apart fairly quickly if they don't eat, if they have to skip a meal. And that's obviously not a sign of metabolic health. And so going on a ketogenic diet, you teach your body to burn fat for energy. That can be fat from your own body, or it can be fat from dietary sources. Either way, you'll be fine. And that leads us to another significant advantage of a ketogenic diet, and is cognitive performance. The brain does very, very well using ketones as a source of energy. And so anyone who has ever had elevated ketone levels in the bloodstream can tell you the mental clarity that you feel when having ketones available as a source of fuel. And that could be because endogenous ketones from a ketogenic lifestyle, or even exogenous ketones in the form of supplements, you'll feel sharper and better mentally just because of the availability of those ketones. So that's one of the main benefits as far as I'm concerned. You also have very sustained energy levels, because think about it. If your body has always access to a source of energy from body fat, even in the absence of food, then you can maintain very stable energy levels. And that's at least true as long as you maintain a fairly low intensity energy consumption, if you will. So in other words, if your energy demands are relatively stable, your supply will be relatively stable and everything is good and you maintain stable levels. However, if you start doing like high intensity type of workouts or very long endurance workouts where you deplete certain energy stores and you need then glucose as a quick source of energy, then you might get into trouble if you're just burning fat for energy and if there is no glucose available. So that's maybe one of the downsides that we'll talk about here in a bit. The other advantage of a ketogenic diet is it is arguably the best diet to lose weight, because as I've mentioned, you teach your body to burn fat for energy. In the absence of food or in between meals, that means body fat. Usually when you're on a keto diet, even if you consume a lot of calories, you will burn body fat when there is no food available and in between meals. And I've noticed it, I've gotten relatively shredded on a keto diet, especially when combined with regular exercise. So a great way to lose weight and to burn body fat in a healthy way that doesn't require caloric restriction. A keto diet very often also removes whole categories of unhealthy foods, especially processed carbohydrates. Now, of course, you can do dirty keto, we'll talk about that in a bit, but generally speaking, by going on a keto diet, especially in the beginning, before you figured out all of those, keto supplements and keto snacks you can buy, if you just do it based on whole food sources, you will remove a whole chunk of unhealthy foods from your diet, which will likely benefit your health overall. And it's very satiating. I mean, if you eat only protein and fat, especially high quality fats, you're not hungry in between meals. You feel full, you feel satisfied, and it just feels very good, and you're not eating a lot of meals. Typically, if you're on a keto diet, a well-designed keto diet, you eat maybe once or twice a day and you feel great with it. The downsides, the longer you stay on keto, the more you figure out, all of those little shortcuts and, like keto-friendly foods like protein bars and snacks and all those things that have likely also processed ingredients, maybe not processed carbohydrates, but processed plant ingredients like nut butters and nut flours, etc. And that can very quickly then deteriorate your health, your gut health in particular. That's one of the reasons why I moved away from, the modern keto diet, because it included a lot of ingredients that my digestive system didn't agree with. It can also impact your electrolyte levels, especially in the beginning. If you remove carbohydrates quickly, then your electrolyte balance is likely going to be off and you have to supplement or consume more. You don't have to supplement, but you have to consume more salt. So sodium in particular is what you'll feel quickly, also magnesium and some of the other minerals, but sodium in particular, and that means you have to eat more salt, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but if you don't, you likely feel funny in your head, lower energy levels, fatigued, crampy, and all of those things that come with, that are typically considered the keto flu. It might also be, a social problem depending on how you eat, and if you go out to a lot of dinners for work or whatever, and you're the one eating differently and not having the dessert and not having the pasta and not having the bread, it might be a social problem, none that you cannot overcome. I mean, we've done that, and I thrive in those. I thrive being different, and show others the way. I try to lead the way for others to follow me, but it might be an issue for some. Physical performance could also be impacted depending on the type of exercise that you do. If you're a CrossFitter maybe, and you're want to go to the games and you have several workouts a day, not having any carbs is probably gonna backfire. You need quick fuel to refuel your glycogen levels, to replenish your glycogen levels in between workouts, and so a keto diet for a CrossFit athlete is likely not gonna be good. You can lift weights very well. I've done a lot of weightlifting and heavy lifting, at least for heavy for me, on a ketogenic diet without any issues. I've done short, high intensity workouts without a problem, but anything longer, and you might hit a wall. It can negatively impact hormone levels, especially in women, be it thyroids, be it, at the end of the day, keto can be a stressor depending on how you do it and depending on your lifestyle and how much demands you have on your, on energy sources. It can be a stressor, and that can negatively impact hormones. It can also negatively impact sleep. If you run out of glycogen halfway into the night, maybe because you've worked out intensively before going to bed, and then you go to bed and your body tries to make glucose from non-carbohydrate sources, but it cannot make it quickly enough. Your cortisol levels might spike. You wake up in the middle of the night and you feel wide awake. I've had that several times, especially on days when I did CrossFit, and so that's one of the downsides. But despite all of that, let's talk about what triggered me to include more carbs in my diet. And the number one reason was really my exercise regimen, which was very much glucose depleting. So it was high intensity type of workouts, especially in the morning. I typically work out fasted. That's what I prefer in the morning. And so, if you're on a keto diet, your glucose level or glycogen levels overnight, might be what they are. Maybe usually they should be fairly restocked, in the morning, since your body had all night to make glucose from non-carbohydrate sources. But then, I go CrossFit in the morning and I empty my glycogen stores to varying degrees, my liver glycogen and my muscle glycogen, and then my stores are empty, and then I continue with my day. And you need glucose. Certain tissues, even the brain in some cases, need glucose to function optimally. And if that glucose is not available because you depleted all of your stores and gluconeogenesis hasn't been quick enough, and then maybe you have to do in something else that relies on glucose, and you don't have those stores available, you might hit a wall. It's not severe, but I could tell that my energy levels were slightly lower post-workout. And that impacted my productivity for the rest of the day. So that was, one thing. The other thing was then obviously with, all the different stress in general. Stress is also something that increases your energy demands and increases your micronutrient demands that we've discussed in a previous episode. And so for me, keto or not having carbohydrates in some cases had become a stressor. Especially sometimes I noticed overnight when I ran out of glycogen stores, depending on my workout regimen and my workout timing, that I ran out of glucose, and my cortisol levels would go up and my sleep was impacted. So from that perspective, I considered keto a stressor that I needed or I wanted to mitigate. Also, being in keto all the time, I don't think mimics ancestral behavior, because they were, depending on the region where our ancestors lived, of course, and maybe then thinking forward, my genetic makeup based on my ancestry, I think it's feasible to assume that our ancestors, again depending on where they lived, had access to carbohydrates during certain times of the year, and during maybe certain times of the day. Maybe they found wild bees and ate the honey, like we've seen with the Hadza. Or whatever sweet fruits, if they were more in warmer regions, etc. So being in keto all of the time for the rest of your life, I don't think, depending on your individual genetic makeup, might not be consistent with your DNA. And so for me, I think my ancestry is from the Italian region, kind of the warmer regions of Europe. And I like to think that there might be a case to be made for consuming certain carbohydrates, at least, during certain times of the year. And then the sleep disturbances, I've mentioned that already. That was, I've noticed that, and I can tell when I have more carbs, I do sleep better. That's just what it is. That's, regardless of how much I liked keto, I've noticed a difference, and I'd rather sleep better than not. And if that means consuming a few more carbs, then that's fine with me. Funny enough though, when a few days ago my wife asked me, so what is the next episode about? I'm like, well, it's about why I stopped keto. And she's like, but you're still doing keto. And I'm like, no, I'm not. I'm eating carbs. And she said, well, but not every day. And I thought about it for a moment, and then coincidentally someone asked me, what do you eat every day? And I'm like, okay, I'm gonna take a picture of every single meal that I have. And yes, there are days where I don't consume carbs, and I feel great with it. And that's especially on days when I don't work out and when I don't deplete my glycogen store. So I guess now my current diet, which is very much based on animal foods with seasonal fruits and all of those things that are generally considered to be part of an animal-based diet, I have days where I don't consume a lot of carbs or no carbs at all, and that's fine. I go based on how I feel, and if I feel like I need carbs, and sometimes that's triggered by stress. Stress naturally increases your body's energy demands, or at least your brain thinks we need to consume energy to deal with the stressor, which in the past was usually something life-threatening. These days, for me, it's likely a stupid comment I get on social media or on YouTube. That's for me a stress-inducing event, and I feel like, I need carbs, to kind of prepare for a fight that's not gonna happen. And usually I'm aware of that and say, no, okay, this is just my body making me think that I need carbs, but I abstain, and then a few minutes later I'm fine. So that's why I stopped keto. Now, that doesn't mean, everyone should, if you're on a ketogenic diet right now, that you should stop doing that. Keto is an excellent tool as far as I'm concerned. If you're on a standard American diet, if you're on any diet that doesn't mimic ancestral eating habits, if you're not on an animal-based diet, a carnivore diet, or something that mimics good dietary habits, a keto diet is a great start. As far as I'm concerned, because it improves metabolic flexibility. That's one of the key things for optimal metabolic health as far as I'm concerned. Your body needs to be able to switch back and forth between different types of fuel depending on availability without you falling apart if one source of fuel is not available temporarily. So that's, great. A keto diet, in particular a carnivore diet, which is a type of ketogenic diet, it's a zero-carb ketogenic diet, is excellent for weight loss. I've talked about this in my IBS video, and I'm probably going to talk about this in an upcoming episode about how I cured irritable bowel syndrome by simply removing everything but meat from my diet. And it wasn't necessarily the macronutrient composition of that diet that fixed my gut, but the avoidance of anything that could potentially irritate my gut. And that's usually, those irritants are usually found in the plant world, And so by removing all of that, you can fix your gut within a couple of weeks, maybe a couple of months, depending on the severity of your issues. To lose weight, keto is the way to go. Carnivore, maybe even better. And I have a separate article about what's the best diet for weight loss. There was a lot of links that I'm going to include in the show notes that talk about, not the pros and cons of keto, side effects, benefits, all of those things. I'm going to link them down below so I don't have to talk about them here in too much detail on the episode. So now let's talk about how has my physical performance and metabolic health changed since introducing carbohydrates into my diet. And so going back to 2016, I think I've done regular blood work, and especially since 2019, I think approximately every 3 to 6 months. So I have a lot of test results that cover the years where I did keto, as well as then later on in 2022, I think, when I started introducing, or late 2021, when I started introducing carbohydrates again. And so let's look at some of those health markers and my workout performance. Let's start with workout performance because it's easier and we can move on then to the more interesting things. From a physical performance, I've noticed that it has improved. I'm doing better at CrossFit with more carbohydrates in general. However, I should say that I still work out fasted and with residual ketones in my bloodstream. So in the morning when I get up, I typically we have dinner around between 5 and 7, I want to say, and I work out usually at 8:30, sometimes at 7:30, sometimes at noon, but usually in the morning. And at that point, I'm in mild ketosis, maybe just below what's considered nutritional ketosis. So I'm maybe, 0.3 to 0.5 mmol per liters, or 3 to 5 ACEs if you do a breath ketone test. So I'm definitely burning some fat for energy, and I'm working out fasted, and I'm doing really well. And the reason, and usually the types of CrossFit workouts, they don't last longer than an hour. They are typically, like high intensity, short weightlifting. I'm not going for, to run a marathon or anything. So fairly short, high intensity stuff. And I have enough liver and muscle glycogen, as well as the ketones, to carry me through those workouts and to perform fairly well. But then in the late afternoon, I have carbohydrates. So I don't force my body to replenish all of those depleted stores by converting protein and amino acids and fatty acids into glucose. I consume certain carbohydrates on most days, so I'm recovered the next day. And I think that has made a significant impact on my workout performance. Not that I'm a competitive athlete, but it still feels good to perform well and to not be, then wasted for the rest of the week. So that's from a physical performance perspective. Mentally, I can tell that if I consume carbs early in the morning, my mental performance goes down the drain, and it sets the tone for the rest of the day. In other words, I never, or not never is not true, but I very rarely consume carbohydrates before noon. If I do, I get those fluctuation in energy as my blood glucose goes up and then it goes down, and I just don't like that. I want to be mentally sharp for most of the day when I have to get work done, when I have to record episodes, and so no carbohydrates in the morning. Typically then with dinner or in the late afternoon, I introduce carbohydrates, because if I then have a slump at around, 8 p.m. or whatever, I don't care, because I'm going to bed anyway, and if I feel like I want to go to bed, I'm fine with that. That's kind of the point. So let's talk about some of the metabolic health metrics, and I wrote a couple of key metrics down here that might be interesting to you. Fasting insulin is the first one. Fasting insulin is one of the most important biomarkers, because it tells you how sensitive your cells are to the hormone insulin. How effective your body can remove glucose from your bloodstream and shuttle it into cells where it can be used for energy, and how much insulin your pancreas has to release. And so for many years, my fasting insulin levels were below the low threshold. They were at 1.8 mmol per liter, I think is the unit. So 2 was like the minimum. So I was considered to be low on insulin, and if you go to a regular doctor, they would probably say, oh, there's something wrong with you. But I talked actually to a couple of metabolic scientists, and they said what that means is that you're incredibly sensitive to insulin, and you're incredibly that's good from a metabolic health perspective. Now, since introducing more carbohydrates, my fasting insulin has actually gone up to 2.2, which is still very much on the lower end, but it's higher than on a ketogenic diet. So I'm not too concerned about that, but it simply shows that by eating more carbs, your insulin is likely gonna go up a little bit. As long as it stays around 2, not a problem whatsoever, as far as I'm concerned. My hemoglobin A1C, the 90-day average blood sugar metric, used to be, actually went up from 5.1 to 5.3. And I actually had a spike somewhere in between there to 5.5. And that was in the very beginning when I introduced carbohydrates, because I think I went slightly overboard. I'm like, oh, now I can have 150 to 200 grams of carbs. And I realized I'm not using all that energy. I don't need that much energy. So my body was actually, I think, retained higher glucose levels than was necessary. And so that has come down now to 5.3 again, which I think is perfectly normal. And it's 0.2 above, my almost zero carb days when I was doing keto. So I think that's still, it's a wash at the end of the day as far as I'm concerned. My thyroid hormone levels normalized, and this is a tricky one because they were on the lower end during keto, and so I thought, well, maybe, keto is not conducive to optimal thyroid health. But again, when talking to metabolic experts and scientists, I said, well, it's like with insulin, maybe your body requires less of the thyroid hormones to do its job, much like it requires less insulin to do its job. So I'm not saying that my low thyroid levels were concerning, but they are now within what's considered a normal range. So I would also say, probably a wash if anything else. My average HDL, the good cholesterol, went up from 47 to 49. So, it actually increased a little bit, but honestly, I had, during all the tests while I was on keto, it was between 40 and 52. So the average just happens to be 47 based on the number of tests I did. And then while eating more carbs, I had levels between 47 to 55, and the average is 49. So, and I had fewer tests while on carbs and more tests while on keto, because I've been doing keto for 3 years and I've been only on carbs for maybe 2 years or so. So the average might be skewed a little bit. I would say it's a wash. They're pretty much the same. My average triglycerides increased from 61 to 67. But again, if we look at the individual tests during keto, I had between 44 to 80. I don't know where that 80 came from. There was an outlier. There was only one that was 80. Everything else was much lower, but that increased the average. And while on carbohydrates or eating more carbohydrates, the average is 67, but the individual tests were somewhere between 49 to 87. Again, 87 was an outlier during the time when I consumed significantly more carbs. And so triglycerides are usually a sign or an indication of how much fat your body is storing from the carbs you're eating. And I think I overdid it, so my body was actually in fat storing mode, hence the increased triglycerides during that one test. But again, 61, 67, with, different, labs and everything, it's probably a wash. My body fat, and that's where it gets interesting, I think, during keto hovered around 13% in 2019. In 2022, it went down to 12%. I don't know what it was in between. I don't have the test results anymore. But then later that same year, in 2022, it went down to 10%. And in this year, in 2023, it went down to 9%. So even though I consumed more carbohydrates, my body fat percentage actually went down. And I'm working out less now than I did in those years. So that's interesting. And I didn't expect that. And I don't know exactly why that is. I can only assume that I might have been eating more calories on keto than I needed, so my body didn't have to tap into all of those fat stores. It could also be, water could be, whenever you do those, body fat tests, intracellular water plays a role, water in your muscle tissue plays a role. So there might be, something skewed maybe that I didn't take into consideration. But overall, I'm apparently leaner than I used to be in 2019. And I'm older obviously than I was in 2019, and I'm eating more carbs. So that's interesting. I do sleep better. I always considered myself a morning person. I can't sleep longer than 5:30. I always told myself, this morning actually I woke up at 7, which is like sleeping in crazy for me. That's sleeping until 7 is like I'm wasting half of my day already. But I do, and I can, and that's the most important thing. I don't wake up at 5 and I'm like wide awake with spiked cortisol and all. I can sleep longer, and I kind of like that. So let's talk about common pitfalls when consuming carbohydrates, just based on my own experience. First is, I alluded to that before, if you're fasting, and even if you're not, technically doing intermittent fasting or anything, but when you break your fast, when you consume your first meal of the day, whenever that might be, don't do it with carbs. If I do that, and my wife can tell you the same, and many people I talk to, it applies to a lot of people, it sets the tone for the rest of your day. If you start with carbs, you keep craving carbs for the rest of your day likely. And so I try to avoid that as much as possible, unless it's maybe a Sunday and my wife makes sourdough pancakes or whatever, and we are like doing something that we don't usually do, and I'm aware of the consequences and I'm accepting those consequences. But otherwise, no carbs in the morning, fat and protein to retain stable energy levels, to retain mental clarity, to remain in ketosis, and later in the day I consume carbohydrates. Now obviously, if you go surfing for 4 hours in the morning, you might benefit from carbohydrates. But even for CrossFit type of workouts, I see a lot of people in the gym at 8:30, and they eat banana or some gooey whatever carbohydrates because they think they may need it for the workout. You do not. Your liver and your muscle tissue has plenty of glycogen to sustain you through a regular CrossFit workout or high intensity workout, be kickboxing or whatever it might be. Unless you're doing a competition where you have a workout in the morning, one at noon and one in the afternoon, you do not need to start with carbohydrates. Not necessary. I would argue it's counterproductive to your performance and to how you feel after the workout. So that's number one. Having carbs right after a workout. So, not only is it, I think it's counterproductive to have carbs right before a workout, but then having your first meal after a workout full of carbohydrates is also counterproductive as far as muscle protein synthesis is concerned. Science has shown that if you consume roughly a 1-to-1 ratio of protein and fat after a workout, it increases muscle protein synthesis and it improves insulin sensitivity. And that's really one of the major factors of metabolic health. So no carbs right after a workout, wait a couple of hours and then have your carbohydrates. You'll do better from a longevity, from a metabolic perspective, and from a growing lean muscle tissue perspective. You don't need carbs right after a workout, unless you have another workout within a couple of hours. Different story. I'm not talking about, professional athletes. I'm talking about regular Joes like you and I. One thing that, having massive amounts of carbohydrates before bedtime. So if you kind of, offload or wait with your carbohydrate intake until later in the day, one of the mistakes I've made is then eat a lot of carbs, especially close to bedtime. Because what that does is, sometimes, we go out and might have, a curry, or, once every 2 months or so, my wife makes sourdough pizza. So pizza made from scratch using sourdough. So likely better than regular pizza, but still, wheat at the end of the day and stuff that is not conducive to optimal health. And when I eat typically a lot, since I only have 2 meals a day. And so if I eat two pizza pies, late in the evening before bedtime, guess what that does? That causes a massive spike in blood sugar, and likely not only one spike, but several spikes, depending on, how those grains are digested. And that is just a recipe for poor sleep. So don't do that. Don't fill up with carbs before bedtime. And the type of carbs you consume is also important. Starchy ones are likely to cause much more prolonged blood sugar spikes. If you consume raw milk, the amino acids in milk actually lower, in raw milk at least, lower your blood sugar response or change your blood sugar response. So raw milk, raw honey, and maybe certain fruits are way better than processed carbohydrates and then starches, for example. So I typically stick, when I'm like, I'm craving something, I feel like I go out and have a glass of raw milk. That takes care of it, and it doesn't cause a terrible spike in blood sugar. Or, if I have it, I typically make raw milk kefir. And so that has even a lower glycemic index. I still get some carbs, but they are fairly slow burning and don't cause a massive spike in blood sugar. And if you really want to find out, how carbs are doing as far as blood sugar response is concerned, wear a continuous glucose monitor. I have several articles I'm going to link down in the show notes that talk about CGMs, the benefits, the different types of CGMs that are on the market, the different, apps you can use to interpret the results and to perform tests and experiments, all of that in the show notes, so check that out. So now let's talk about tips on how to leverage low-carb eating to improve your health and well-being. So my recommendation is to adjust your carb intake to your energy needs. Don't consume carbs, excess carbs, if you're not burning them, So if you're not working out on a day, if you're in a, sedative type of environment, if you don't, do anything that might require, fast burning energy like glucose, don't consume it, or limit your intake significantly to match your energy demands or your needs. Don't eat carbs first thing in the morning. I mentioned that. Don't eat carbs right after exercise. I mentioned that too. Exercise or walk after consuming carbs. I've done certain experiments using or wearing a CGM that if you consume carbohydrates and you immediately go for a 30-minute walk, it can be a casual walk. You don't have to run or almost run or be a fast-paced kind of walk. It doesn't have to be a brisk walk. I mean, the more energy you expend in terms of physical activity, the more it will blunt your blood sugar spike. But just going for a casual walk with the dog after consuming carbs helps improve your blood sugar response and means your body likely requires less insulin, which saves your pancreas and keeps your insulin sensitivity intact. So that's one great way of dealing with it. Stick with carbs from clean sources, obviously, raw milk, raw honey, fruits, etc. Not processed carbs, bad idea. Wear a CGM so you can kind of find out how certain types of carbs work for you. Some people do very well with bananas, some people do very poorly with bananas. It depends on your individual physiology to kind of find out what works best for you. In terms of mistakes to avoid on a low-carb diet, if that's the way you want to go, number one is not consuming enough electrolytes. If you're on low carb, on keto diet, on a carnivore diet, you likely will have to increase your salt intake. Now, there are some people that say, I'm doing fairly well without eating any salt whatsoever. It might just be an adjustment period, but I've noticed personally, I do very well on a higher salt or sodium intake. So we typically, we leverage electrolyte supplements like the one from Element. I'm going to link it down below as well. It tastes very good, it's very clean, and it provides the right amount, the right ratios of sodium, magnesium, and potassium. And with that, I do incredibly well, physically, mentally, and everything in between. Stay away from processed keto-friendly, products like, nut butters and all of those things that either ruin your gut or are, just by the fact they are processed, they are likely not good for you and have a negative impact on your health that can derail some of those efforts or some of the benefits that you get from a low-carb ketogenic diet. Eating the wrong types of fat and protein. You don't want to do a keto on a vegan diet with plant-based sources of fat. That's just a recipe for poor health. If you do keto, leverage high-quality animal proteins and high-quality animal-based fats. Eating, bacon fried in canola oil and low quality eggs. I mean, it's keto friendly, but it's probably not the type of keto diet you want to do. Stick with clean ingredients. It's one of the reasons why I followed a paleo ketogenic diet, but even that can be improved. I would actually do I would call it an animal-based ketogenic diet with high quality types of fat and protein from animal-based sources. And listen to your body, or not listening to your body is one of the key mistakes. If you feel like on certain days, especially if you're a woman and you're, close to, depending on the, when you are in your natural cycle, in a menstrual cycle, there are certain days where if your body, tells you, I'm going to prepare for pregnancy, whether or not that pregnancy is actually coming, and I have higher energy demands, and you ignore them and keep working out and keep doing fasting and keep doing keto, that might not be conducive to optimal health, reproductive health or otherwise. So listen to your body and not give into cravings, but consider what your body is asking, and then think about is this a craving for something that might be caused by anxiety or stress, or is this truly something my body requires? Very often cravings I've noticed are cravings for protein, and the other day I told my wife, or the kids actually, do the apple test. If you feel like you need to eat something, would you eat an apple right now? If the answer is yes, then maybe you're really hungry and you need something. If the answer is no, then it's just a craving for something you shouldn't be eating anyway. And yeah, with that was it. So the bottom line really is, I don't think there is a right answer whether or not you should be doing keto or not keto. I think the answer is always based on your individual needs and your exercise regimen, your individual requirements, your energy demands at the end of the day, your genetics to a degree, and a lot of other factors that you have to take into consideration. But I'm hoping that with this episode you got a couple of clues and hints and maybe some additional piece of information that you can leverage to fine-tune your existing dietary framework and to figure out if keto is right for you, or if you might be doing better with introducing certain carbohydrates into your diet. Ton of links in the show notes, check them out, and I hope I see and hear you in the next episode.